Since as right now we're in hiatus time for network TV shows, I think this would be a good point for me to sort of touch base and give sort of a halfway rating of some of the stuff I've been watching. Now, none of this stuff I've had a passionate enough feeling about to do episode by episode reviews like I have with, say, Doctor Who, but you know what? I think it's worth touching on since we're kind of in the lull between their first and second halves. The first one I want to talk about is one I did not think I was ever going to want to talk about again. Gotham. If you saw my original tag team review that I did with Ryan Daly, was not a fan of that pilot. Still not a fan of that pilot. However, I have turned around on the show. Even the second episode, things were already looking better. And by the third episode, which was Balloon Man, that was the one that turned me around, and I now actually look forward to that show, and I'm looking forward to when it comes back. Balloon Man really was the one that turned me around because it started to accomplish a number of things. It got a dynamic working between Gordon and Bullock that was more dynamic and more interesting as they were starting to come to terms with each other, because initially they were just banging heads so hard that it was annoying. Gordon was starting to operate in the world a little bit better. He's started to become slightly more compromised by the situation. I mean, he's still the White Knight, relatively speaking, but the shine's off him a little bit. He's becoming more attuned to the reality of where he is, and not having him so naively and steadfastly, blindly just doing the right thing. It makes him more dynamic and makes him more interesting. And the Balloon Man also marked the point at which they started to bring in some of the more fun and somewhat ridiculous elements that you get out of a comic book world. I mean, a vigilante who kills people by attaching them to weather balloons, that's kind of nuts, and in that fun comic book way. And it really wasn't until that episode that the show started to embrace that side of it. It had gone pretty grim, pretty gritty, pretty cop show initially, and I know that's the pitch of the show, but it seemed like, why would this even have to be set in Gotham if you're not going to embrace any aspect of that world? Well, they started to with that episode, and they've taken some good aspects of that going forward. The Penguin continues to be the absolute highlight of the show, but as I said, Jim Gordon has actually grown on me. There have been some other good ones. I really like the interpretation of Victor Zsasz that we got, although I really could have done without the completely superfluous henchmen they paired him with. I like a lot of the behind-the-scenes power plays that are going on between the mobsters, and I like that it's not a flat-out war, because we've seen that a lot in movies, TV, what have you, an all-out mob war. But to see these two crime families, Maroni and Falcone, existing in the same world and obviously continually trying to undermine and undercut and take over ground from the other, but not being able to do so out in the open, and still sort of having this begrudging sort of understanding it's not really a truce and they'd like to knock each other out but they can't thing is interesting and much more dynamic than I think we tend to get. Alfred's working much better as a character. He was a little schizophrenic at first because they weren't really reconciling his paternal instincts with his much tougher sort of ex-military vibe that they had decided to saddle him with, which there's nothing wrong with that choice, but they weren't really marrying those aspects. They've found that rhythm with him since then. And the show as a whole has found its approach to procedurals that it's now working pretty well while still having the continuing sort of story of largely the crime families battling it out for control. So like I said, I've really turned around on the show and I do enjoy it at this point. There are a couple of things that are still not working though. The big one is Barbara. She has become exactly what I was afraid she was going to be, which is the hanger-on baggage girlfriend that heroes tend to get saddled with. She's not an asset to him, she's a liability. And that is made so explicit by an episode where he sends her away because he's about to do something that is going to put him in direct extreme danger. He doesn't want her anywhere near it. And what does she do? She comes back. And it wasn't like one of those cases like, go see your mother, I can't tell you why. She knew what he was going to do. She knew he was in danger. She knew that her being around was going to make it harder for him, and she came back. At that point, she just became completely worthless as a character in my eyes, and she hasn't gotten any better since. The handling of Bruce Wayne has also been a little bit off. It's been better than I thought it was going to be, partly because they're putting a nice emphasis on the detective side of Batman. Because with Batman Begins and the Nolan movies, we got a very heavy emphasis on the combat side of Batman, basically sort of the ninja aspect of Batman. And his role as a detective was fairly underplayed. Now, you can't have this young version of Bruce Wayne just kicking the butts of criminals, but you can have him develop his mind and his deductive skills, and they've had him doing that, and it's worked very well. things get a little bit off for me when they start having him interact, especially with other kids, because they've made him, I think they're just trying to go for socially awkward. He comes off, honestly, as some degree of autistic. Just with the extent that he takes things literally, doesn't seem to understand normal human emotional interactions. He has to get Alfred explain stuff to him. It just seems off. They made him a little too removed from a normal child's life, I think, than was warranted. Selina Kyle, Kat, she's also kind of back and forth for me. She works fairly well when she's interacting with adults. When she's working with Bruce, not so much. I think part of it's just the line reading she gives. They're clunky. Part of that might be the writing. But when they try and have her be a kid, it doesn't work so well. Then when they've got her sort of functioning as a story element, you know, being a character with information, a character who's breaking into things, she works better. Although I really cringed when they brought back Ivy, because this was a throw-in and a nod that just it seems to serve no purpose, and it looks like they probably are going to bring her back to some extent, and I don't understand why. Edward Nygma, though, surprisingly has worked pretty well for me. The few times that they've put more emphasis and lingered on him a bit more, he's a little grating, but in terms of his function in the world, I think it was a pretty interesting call, making him a forensics guy that everybody's kind of annoyed by. I am now a fan of the show, but the mid-season finale really had a lot of the problems that I'd had back in the pilot that the show had actually sort of gotten over, but then they all came back. Things like what I've talked about, Barbara, Bruce not really working so well, bringing back Ivy, these nods to things in the comic, but not actually integrating them in any way that felt meaningful. So that sort of showed me that the show can still dip back into those early habits. Now, even that episode did not do it as badly as the pilot. The pilot was just a mess. But I'm going to give props to this show. It has grown and has grown on me, and I feel it's actually pretty strong at this point. You know, it's pretty rare for me to see a show that just does not work at the front end and then gets steadily better after that. Especially within the same season. I've seen some shows the first season is not great, then it gets better the second season. This was one within that first season it even turned around. Have you ever had an experience like that? What was a show that for you started out weak, got better? Did it do it within the first season? Did it take a little while? Whatever it was, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Until next time, this council is adjourned.